We mean to cancel the worldview civilized people made. We will simply erase history from the time that machinery and weapons threatened more than they offered. And when you die, the last living reminder of hell will be gone.
Kind of takes the fun out of being alive, doesn't it?
I see dead people. Dead people.
There will be no order, only chaos.
Kind of takes the fun out of being alive, doesn't it?
Only chaos.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 2 feet small.
And as the intro song always alludes, my beloved true seekers, deeper down that rabbit hole we go. Alice being another symbolical prototype of Sophia, or the human soul's fall and redemption, of thousands you have missed throughout your life, but are ever so present. Deeper into the knowledge of the heart, as a Gnostic sage once called it, that we know as Gnosis. And deeper yet safer you enter the virtual Alexandria here at Aeon Byte, broadcast through the GodAboveGod.cam every week in your incessant exploration of a capacious, honey-dawn horizon of wondrous esoteric secrets contained in the arcane databases of the Gnostics and their brethren in the esoterica.
No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world.
Yes, we are the Gnostics. We're not so much concerned with being good, but being wise in all its facets, potentials, and capabilities. We have no use for faith except in our experiences, worldly or otherworldly. We are the jugglers of logic and imagination, walk the razor's edge between atheism and theism. We are the myth makers and infernal artists who will go to any length to light up the skies of consciousness with our burning third eye laser vision.
We are not of one mind, but we now speak with one voice.
We don't believe in much, mere insecure hope in future phantoms, but we do believe in nurturing compassion, a caring, a respect, and a sympathy for all other entities that do not understand that they are already it. They are all Christs, Buddhas, and Krishnas, if they would only experience what the Greeks call anamnesis, the recalling of what we truly are. Nothing more and nothing less than gods. No, better and older than gods, for the gods are also trapped in the wheel of dukkha, or suffering in Buddhism.
Forget the old ways, brother, all the old hatreds, all the old pains.
Gnosticism is not a religion, faith, or even theology when it comes down to it, after putting your cards on the table in that last bet. Gnosticism is a revolution of the mind and spirit. It is a revival of the divine that is secretly sown in everything, as the Gnostic sage Basilides wrote, even as he said ignorance collects on everything like rust on iron. Gnosticism is an ecstatic awakening and awareness of all that is real and all that is unreal, inside and outside of us, an adrenaline intuition of actualities beyond the material world, as well as the galaxies within our essence.
I am not a number. I am a free man.
And like all revolutions, it is wild, disturbing, and full of sacrifice. But being a spiritual one, although it certainly aims to better the world, it is humble, peaceful, yet diamond sharp in its expression. It takes many forms so that the zeitgeist of its era understands it, or more like those who are ready for it.
The Lord gave my son the strength to get off drugs.
Ma'am, I know your son. And believe me, he was better off on the drugs.
Whether it's the realized internal apocalypse of Simon Magus, the melancholic nuclear poetry of William Blake, the psycho-spiritual magic of C.G. Jung, or the archetypal vision of Truman being smashed against the waves by the Creator God while trying to reach Sophia, and it flares throughout the darkest moments of history like a pulsar of compassed dreams. Gnosticism is coming home while understanding you don't have a home. It is a meeting of long-lost friends that whisper to and through you the wisdom of the ages from both the future and the past.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
It is a sense of oneness with an urgency of sanitizing all the dead veins of illusion that create separation among all consciousness in the universe. Gnosticism is all of this and none of this. I am and I am Abraxas, and in some accounts he is truly the supreme archon and demonic lord of the multiverse, the one and only black hole sun.
The Hell Beast is above us, and I can smell an evil slut!
So everything I say might be a punch-and-Judy lie to break your heart one more time. But if you don't press the play button, you'll never know if you're truly Master Chief, or Laura Croft, or Link, or just worthless pixels on the screen of a cooling universe. So continue with me at your own risk and peril. Continue with me to the hells and heavens that encompass your being, or go back to retrieve the safe blankets of orthodoxy, literalism, and fundamentalism, so warm and soft, yet full of satanic smallpox, spread by Jehovah and his angelic mafia, that infect your metaphysical genetic code with the counterfeit spirit, the false you, the chains of karma, the cords of destiny, each written with all of your attachments, failures, and sins against the truth. The Greeks called it Hermeticism, or simply fate, and they feared her more than anything. So should you.
Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those without.
And it may surprise many of you, but one of the greatest keys in inhaling the Gnostic spirit, as well as being released from the Hermeticism, comes from what most people believe is one of the 4 pillars of the New Testament, and that is the Canonical Gospel of John. But that shouldn't be a surprise, for we have proven in past shows of Aeon Byte how orthodoxy has continually co-opted the Gnostics in order to date-rate their message and stamp a trademark of spiritual monopoly. But once again I say no more. It's time to give back what belongs to us, so that our awakening from the 13th floor or the dark city, that hologram over history that makes us think we live in a free, harmonious, and civilized time, can be complete.
None of this is real. You pull the plug, I disappear, and nothing I ever say, nothing I ever do, will ever matter.
With us in this eternal now, but in time approximately Saturday, February 28th, the year of our demiurge 2009, to understand the oh-so-ever quoted by Fundy's Gospel of John, is one of the rising stars in Gnostic studies, and that is April de Conick, author of The 13th Apostle, Voices of the Mystics, Recovering the Original Gospel of Thomas, and professor of religious studies at Rice University. April is one of those rare cats that truly comprehends the multifarious levels not only of Gnosticism, but ancient mysticism in general.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
Her views are the perfect balance of princely Gnostic scholarship as well as a mystagogue insight into the Gnostic nervous system itself. Mark my words, my beloved true seekers. She will be one of the august Gnostic pioneers of history and time when, Without mentioning any names, many of the more famous scholars have all but jumped the shark. For a taste of her sapience, please visit her website, aprildeconic.com, and Deconic is spelled D-E-C-O-N-I-C-K. We'll never know the embryonic version of the Gospel of John. There are no original copies or anything close to original copies of basically all ancient texts of history.
Scholars maintain that the translation was lost hundreds of years ago.
But through our Python intuition and instinct, some knowledge of textual criticism, and an anthropological understanding of those early days of Gnosticism and proto-Christianity, we can come to orbit the kernel truths of this esoteric treatise and feel its soul-attracting gravity into the domains of the ethereal.
You propose nothing in the sight of God.
What we do know for certainty is that it was the Gnostics who first utilized, understood, and deciphered the holy inventory stored in the Gospel of Juan. Beyond the historical data, early in the 2nd century, we have expositions of the 4th Gospel from the Valentinians Heraclon and Theodotus, the references in the Nicene fragments quoted by Hippolytus. Both Orthodox and Gnostic sources have claimed that it was the Egyptian Gnostic rebel Cerinthus who was the true author of this work. That's certainly an open and closed case, as well as a tragedy that Orthodoxy would later claim Johnny's divine screenplay as its own, and as always, tinker with it badly like the demiurge tinkered with the placenta substance of Sophia after her fall, and then constructed our dear benign universe.
Well, it was nice to meet you, God. Thank you for the Grand Canyon, and good luck with the apocalypse. Oh, and by the way, you suck!
We also know that our favorite medieval heretics, the Gnostic Cathars, only use the Gospel of John as Holy Writ. J. Raskins, in his fulgid book, The Evolution of Christ and Christianities, reconstructs the Gospel of John with a keen intellectual scalpel and proposes that the story really is about John the Baptist and not Jesus. Through a sleight of hand by orthodoxy, Jesus replaces John as the Word made flesh.
And I'm here on a mission of mercy.
This certainly plays into the hands of the Johannite tradition that is found even today in many Gnostic churches who don't consider themselves Christian. Also the theology of the Gnostic Mandeans of Iraq, bringing up the Cathars again, and the fondness the Knight Templars had for the baptizer. Beyond that, we can certainly read the thematic heartbeat of John's Evangelion and feel the pulsing lifeblood of a mystical and Gnostic constitution. Simply understand the story. The Logos, God's reason, grabs from a heavenly wardrobe a coat of monkey skin and descends into the world of forms. There he imparts mysteries to the initiated and awakened that reveal the narrow path into the bosom of the nebula of the divine.
Underestimated from day one. You'd never think I was a master of the universe now, would you?
Unlike the Synoptic Gospels and so much Apocrypha, there are no parables, just an allogenes or stranger in Greek, stating ontological and electrifying statements of I ams. Reading it allegorically and metaphorically, don't you think this story is perhaps not only about this alien entity, truly infinity casting itself as finite for humanity's understanding, but really about us and our recognition of our own godhood? I am the way. I am the light of the world. I am not of this world. I am the resurrection. I am the life. I am the truth, and I am the life. I am. I am. I am.
The whole world revolves around me.
So these remarks pertain to the submerged plausibility of every human to commute from the finite to the infinite by a process of self-knowledge and self-discovery. I am, I am, I am. And the Jesus of the Gospel of John is different from the other Christs of the Bible, although they are all written in the backdrop of the Hellenistic tragic hero that was popular with readers of those days. This Jesus also refers himself as the living waters, a motif popular in the Gnostic worldview, such as Manichaeanism, certain Nag Hammadi library tractates like the Paraphrase of Shem or the Gospel of the Egyptians, and the writings of St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 10 being one example. You won't find living waters in the Synoptics or the writings of the Church Fathers.
Prepare to receive the true Lord!
This Jesus is in complete control the entire time, overcoming the bosses and hard-saving throw snares of the powers and principalities. This Jesus says, "Haven't you heard? Ye are all gods." His resurrection transforms him into a unique being with astral flesh that has left his monkey skin, his lower self behind.
I reveal myself to myself, and I am drenched and purged.
And lastly, this Joshua incarnation is more than in any gospel, Gnostic or Orthodox, the true representation of the dying, rising God-man Savior of the mystery schools, who we are meant to devour in order to assimilate. I am, I am, I am. And there are many more clues, my beloved truth seekers, that we could spend more time than Congress does in giving money away to reward institutions that have hurt America. But I won't Guantanamo Bay you too much with my drivel.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
One very obvious example of John's Gnosticism is found in chapter 8, in one of those notorious scenes in which the Logos talks smack with the Pharisees. It reads,
I know that you are Abraham's seed, yet you seek to kill me, because my word finds no place in you. I say the things which I have seen with my father, and you also do the things which you have seen with your father. They answered him, Our father is Abraham. Jesus said to them, If you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth which I heard from God. Abraham didn't do this. You do the works of your father. They said to him, We were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, God. Therefore Jesus said to them, If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came out and have come from God. For I haven't come of myself, but He sent me. Why don't you understand my speech? Because you can't hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and doesn't stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks on his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. But because I tell the truth, you don't believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears the words of God. For this cause you don't hear, because you are not of God.
So basically Jesus is saying outright that his Father is not the God of the Orthodox of his days, who although called him the devil, we can logically trace to being the demiurge. And of course you can look at the interaction of Jesus with Nicodemus, the raising of Lazarus, the wedding at Cana, the meeting of the Samaritan woman at the well, the healing of the blind man who is strangely cursed with blindness because of sins he did before he was born, hint reincarnation, and other scenes that are obvious mass references to initiations into higher states of consciousness. Or just the old Gnostic theme of those who know and those who simply do not know. Divine knowledge and ignorance permeate the Gospel of John if you read it with virgin eyes, my beloved truth seekers.
Witness the wonders of an ancient glory.
Even the language of the Gospel of John is ripe with Hermetical Mystery School and Pauline lingo and context, just like the living waters agnomen I used before. Some examples are word, logos, life, zoe, truth, aletheia, grace, charis, glory, doxa, light, phos, darkness, scotia, birth, genete, sacred places, topos, flesh, sarx, wind, pneuma, advocate, parakletos, and many other Greek words.
Are you running a high fever? How could you conceive of something so idiotic?
And some of the scenes are just plain out of mystery school tradition that is one of the veins of Gnosticism. The wedding of Cana is taken directly from the myth of Dionysus, who does the same exact David Copperfield trick. The story of Jesus guessing the 153 fish is from an earlier tale of Pythagoras. Jesus raising Lazarus is a parallel to when Horus raised Osiris, while Isis and her sister Nephthys, who are represented by the two Marys, hover over the grave in mourning. The feeding of the 5,000, as David Feidler and Margaret Starboard have revealed, is but bare-ass gematria, or what some have called Greek Kabbalah or ancient numerology.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
April opens many other windows to the moldy, dusty rooms of our ransom, conditioned perception, both in the interview and her book, Voices of the Mystics. But also read some Bultmann, Robert Price, or go to earlychristianswritings.cam/John for more of the flammable mysticism and mustard seed message of the beloved disciple. Check out the book, The Gospel of John in the Light of Indian Mysticism by Ravi Ravindra. Do some of your own homework. Remember, I could be the black hole's son.
I am the devil.
But enough of my drivel. April de Conick, taking on the form of the Word and descending into the virtual Alexandria to teach us things we simply had forgotten before being conditioned in the umbrella corporation of Jehovah and his angelic mafia. I am, I am, I am. Don't forget about that. There are so many answers in simply saying that. I am, I am, I am. This is the Aeon Byte interview. With us today, we have April de Conick to discuss the mysticism and Gnosticism of the Gospel of John, and hopefully a little bit further. How are you doing today, April?
Very good. Glad to be with you today.
I'm very happy to have you back. Thank you very much. Obviously, most ancient Gospels weren't written for the, entire Greco-Roman world in a mass market manner, as so many Christians believe. It was a different time. As you and other scholars point out, Gospels, or perhaps letters, were written for an immediate community. Could you tell us your views about the Johannite community where the Gospel of John originated from?
Sure. These documents, we understand them to be community documents in that they are reflecting particular traditions that have developed in a geographical location among a community of believers over a period of time. And the traditions tend to change, reflecting the sort of crises and thinking of this particular group of Christians. In the case of the Gospel of John, it's actually difficult to locate its provenance. There are a couple of possibilities. Traditionally, it's understood to be a gospel from Asia Minor. Ephesus is its origin. And one of the reasons that scholars have thought this is that there is a heavy polemic in the text against John the Baptist. And we learn from Paul and from Acts that in Ephesus there was apparently some believers who had been baptized with the baptism of John. And so this is one of the reasons that it's sometimes placed here in Ephesus. One of the difficulties with this is that we also learn from Acts that Apollos is the one who appears to have been the leader of that, and he came from Egypt, where he appears to have learned this baptism of John. So this gospel could just as likely have originated in Alexandria, perhaps. And certainly this gospel has a lot of affinity with later Alexandrine theology. Other scholars have been placing it in Syria. So again, it's difficult to know. Some of the Syrian traditions reflect Johannine thought as well. So 3 possibilities for you.
So the Johannites and the Thomasite community might have lived side by side the whole time.
They very well could have been living close. And the other thing to keep in mind is that there's a trade route from East Syria, from Edessa, that goes down into Alexandria. So we know that texts were passing back and forth between the Alexandrine community of Christians and the Syrian community of Christians. And so if traditions that originate in both of these cities and these areas would have been passing back and forth, information and sharing ideas and so forth. And so we find a lot of similar developments in theology between Alexandria and Syria.
And also, it's, a lot of people have said that the Gospel of John is the most anti-Jewish of all the Gospels. So is it safe to say that this community was very unhappy with Jerusalem at the time or period?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that. Here we've got the Christianity, when it's moving into the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century, begins to show signs of anti-Semitism. And this is one of the real problems in early Christian studies, is why this was happening. But one of the things that was happening is that the Christians were beginning to understand themselves as a group separate from the Jews. And once they began to do this, there was a shift to demonize the Jews. And so we see this happening in the texts, like I said, that were written at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century, when this is really starting, which would be, the Gospel of John would be a good example of that.
Yes, and of course by then there was no temple, and so...
Right. Right.
So...
Well, and see, you've got really two competing groups. The traditional, the Jews are trying to redefine their religion without a temple, and the Christians are trying to redefine their religion without a temple as well, because they came out of the Jewish tradition. That's what they were, and they were finding at the time that the Jews were not the ones that were converting to their form of Judaism. And so you have a competition going on as well. In the case of, Christianity lost that battle in terms of Judaism. They became their own thing, right? They became something that they self-defined as different from the Jews. And once that happened, that's when you start to see the anti-Semitism really rearing its head.
And are there any theories about the Gospel of John having Samaritan origins? Could that be a reason they're so polemical?
There is material in the Gospel of John that is highly suggestive that there were Samaritans who were converting to this community at one time. The Samaritans thought very highly of Moses. Moses was their central figure, and so you see Jesus in the Gospel of John being compared to Moses. Think about chapter 6, where he's the one that has the staff, and he's the one that gives the bread, right, his body, and so forth. He's the manna. You get a lot of comparisons with Moses in the text. You get, of course, the Samaritan woman at the well, who Jesus gives the water to because she recognizes him as a great prophet. So there is something to that.
You give ample evidence that Judaism already had strong mystical components long before Christianity, based on a large body of apocrypha that you give evidence of in your book. Voices of the Mystics, and it's usually with Enoch, Moses, Ezekiel traveling up the heavens to the Holy of Holies. I guess they decided, instead of waiting for God to come talk to us, we're going to go to him. But so did this eventually transfer to the Johannite and other Christian mystics or eschatological communities, with basically Jesus becoming the mystagogue, imparting his vision of places that only he had seen?
I think that is what's happening within these Christian traditions. They certainly, the early Christian tradition, what I've studied of it was certainly centered on mysticism, and they were basically Jewish mystics. If you look at all the evidence in terms of their emphasis on visions that they were having, revelations that they were having, the notion that the Spirit of God has been released and is among them, within them, transforming their lives. All of this is talk that other Jews were using in terms of a kind of a precursor of what we call Merkava mysticism, which is a form of Jewish mysticism that is certainly around by the 3rd century, where you have actually devotees attempting to make this very dangerous journey through the heavens in order to come to stand as like an angel, to be transformed into an angel before God's throne, and maybe even to take a peek and glance a vision of him if they can. We have a precursor of this sort of activity going on even at Qumran. We also, I think, have knowledge of this in our early Christian materials as well. And so I think that some of our texts are certainly understanding Jesus in these terms, as someone who's come to impart these mysteries to the faithful.
And the question, April, would be, how much did the pagan Hellenistic mystic view influence it? Are we looking at a fusion of Judaism and the Hellenistic viewpoint in the Gospel of John?
Oh, I would think so. I think you do have a fusion. It's really hard to separate strands sometimes and to say, well, this came from here and this came from here. When in fact, you think of a culture, or you think of like just living within a religion and in a time period, it's not that you are like taking something from here and something from there and fusing it together. It's more like you just exist within this world of thoughts and ideas, and they're all part of you. And that's what we have going on in terms of, the community associated with the Gospel of John, with the Gospel of Thomas. They're part of this worldview of Jewish mysticism, but they're also very familiar with the Hellenistic mystery religions and the sort of initiation processes that they were using in those mystery religions. And I think that, in fact, the Eucharist ceremony, as it develops in terms of Paul and later, is probably highly influenced by the Greek mystery religions, especially in terms of eating a body and drinking blood, which is something that is not going to happen solely within a Jewish community.
Yeah, that's very true. Like we talked before the interview in Hans Jonas, you have to put yourself in the mindset of what these people believe, and of course, Plato would be,
right,
in the mind.
He's standard. He's just standard
for
right?
any Jew. For any Jew in the diaspora.
Exactly, and your best friend has been initiated into the Lusinian mysteries, and your other one goes to the Temple of Isis, and so on and so forth. You have this wide variety of ideas and experiences that are just part of your culture. And in order to really understand these ancient texts, I mean, my opinion is we really have to get back into the mind and of the ancient people as much as we can and try to put on their worldview. It's not an easy thing to do.
And also, April, you spend a whole chapter on Johannine polemics against vision mysticism.
Right.
What exactly is vision mysticism, and what is the evidence of this, even though it appears the Gospel of John has strong mystic elements?
Right. It's really fascinating. What you have going on with the Johannine community is a group of people who are certainly inspired by mysticism, maybe even some Hermetic practices, but they also are very concerned about, in some way, controlling those. If you can imagine, if you can imagine a community in which people are they're actually trying to have visions, okay? That might get out of control at some point. Someone may have a vision or a revelation that maybe says, maybe a leader says, maybe the leader of our community, we shouldn't, we should kick him out because he's really not the right one. I'm the right one, or whatever. This sort of activity that is internal activity like this can't really be controlled. It can become very dangerous for a community. And so what you have in the Gospel of John is an attempt to put some controls on the mysticism, I think. They are not advocating, like, I'm going to take you through an initiation ritual and we're going to ascend up to the Merkava and we're going to have a vision of God. They're actually saying in this text that the only one that's ever seen God is Jesus. And that, in fact, that door to heaven is closed. And so the reason that it's closed, they say, is because God came down to earth as Jesus. So his manifestation actually walked around on earth. And so the vision that people had was of Jesus on earth, and that vision was what is ultimately transforming. So I think they began with that sort of understanding of mysticism, in which they were trying to control visions that may be getting out of hand. And then it goes to the next step. Then you can hear people in the community saying, yeah, but what about us? We didn't get to see him walking around. Shouldn't we be trying to get up to heaven to see him? And the response then is, well, no. In his absence, he sent down the Spirit, or the Paraclete. And that Spirit now lives among us and provides us with that experience of the divine right here on earth. So there's still a mysticism involved here, but it no longer is a, if you will, a flight to heaven to have a vision sort of mysticism. But it's a God Spirit has come down, has entered the community, has entered us in our baptismal practice probably here. Also in our Eucharist practices, we're eating the divine body, it's entering us. And so they've moved in that direction in terms of encountering the divine in the immediate.
So basically they said, have your vision, but Jesus is still the gatekeeper, the ultimate gatekeeper.
Well, I think they're even saying, don't worry about the vision. Don't have the vision. That's not what's important. What is important is that you are part of our church. You have been given the Holy Spirit, and that is the divine encounter.
Well, I wish I could record this for every time that somebody quotes me John 3:14 and tell them the real context of, I am the way to the Father and all that.
That's it right there. That is exactly the whole thesis of that gospel, is that Jesus as the, if you will, the kavod, or the manifestation of God, has come to earth, and then he sent his Spirit, which is again his manifestation after his death, and that is the way to God, is by getting that Spirit in you. And it was happening for the Johannine community, as for other Christians. I mean, this is very much like what Paul is saying as well in Romans. It happens by the Spirit entering you in baptism and Eucharist.
And is this what you would call, like you talk in your book, faith mysticism?
It is, and it really encapsulates, I think, well in chapter 20 with, the scene of Thomas, where Jesus said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And the believe is it's not faith in terms of, what do I want to say, like dogma or doctrine. It has more to do with a faithful encounter with God, an actual experience of God through, as they say in the Gospel of John, through the Paraclete living among them as loving kindness.
He returns with a new body, and Mary does not will not touch him. Well, how do you read that famous scene?
Boy, that is a tough scene, and I don't really have a good explanation for that phrase, "Stop touching me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." I don't know. What ideas do you have? You don't have any?
I would say definitely plays into the Gnostic Docetic view. You know, he is now
well, the
something
thing
else.
is, this is the thing though. He's a resurrected being. This is not the same physical body that he had when he was walking around among them. This is an altered body that, the text says can now walk through doors. And so I actually don't read the scene in chapter 20 where Thomas is, where Thomas is supposedly touching him as being a attempt at touching the flesh. Jesus is an angelic body at this point, and so there's something else going on here that I think we as scholars haven't quite sorted out yet.
Right. Well, I just see it simply as the old Gnostic view. Jesus has taken off his clothes and now he has his real form, but I guess that's how a lot of Gnostics probably saw it. But April, talking about the Paraclete, so it's pretty safe to say that the Paraclete was a spirit, because I know some Gnostics thought the Paraclete was Paul, and obviously Muslims think the Paraclete is Muhammad. But it's pretty safe to say he was a spirit. It's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, well, actually, you can kind of go both directions with this. The Paraclete is the Holy Spirit. It's some sort of angelic figure, and it was believed to, if you will, possess people. So Jesus was a Paraclete because he talks about sending another Paraclete. In the 2nd century, you have Montanus, who claims that he's the Paraclete, right? The Holy Spirit has come and descended upon him, and so he's the other Paraclete that Jesus talked about. And so you have Manny making some similar claims, 3rd century, and so forth. So it's kind of this cyclic idea in Judaism that you have of the coming of a prophet who's been blessed with the Spirit, and the Paraclete is just the Johannine name for that.
What are some of the Gnostic echoes we find in the Gospel of John, or at least why was it so popular with some of the groups like the Valentinians and the Cathars? You got Heraclian, was it Heraclian who wrote a whole thing on the Gospel of John, and Theodotus wrote about the Gospel of John.
Listen, the Gospel of John was by far the favorite Gnostic gospel. And it so surprises me that it actually made it into the canon. And I think the only reason it did is because Irenaeus loved it and wasn't going to let the Gnostics have it. But he
just wasn't going to let them have anything.
He just wasn't going to let them have at least his beloved Gospel of John. This text, the more that the older I get as a scholar, the more I study, this text becomes more and more perplexing to me. It, I think, is a gospel that is coming out of a community that is going to split in the beginning of the 2nd century. And part of the split is going to go more toward what we call Orthodox or Apostolic Christianity, and the other part of this community is going to go, I think, into the Valentinian tradition. So I think this gospel already has its origins within a group that is going to become a Gnostic group eventually. I wouldn't quite call it proto-Gnosticism, but it certainly is a text that's starting to think about issues along the lines that at least the Valentinians and maybe some other Gnostics were also thinking about these issues. Extremely important to the Gnostic viewpoint was the idea that the soul had fallen into the material realm and was suffering here. So the prologue of the Gospel of John in many ways is understood by scholars to be kind of a representative of that mythology. And it's not that the Gnostics were the only one talking about this. certainly not. The Orthodox Christians were also interested in this idea, but this becomes a major theme of the Gnostics, and so they love the Gospel of John because of that, and they liked to talk about the prologue quite a bit in their own writings. And there are a lot of hymns within the Gnostic literature about this descent of the soul that look very similar to what we have going on in the Gospel of John. So that is a very good example. The other thing about this text is that it talks about the ruler of this world. And the ruler of this world, the text understands to be an evil figure. And the Orthodox or Apostolic Christians understand that to be Satan. But the Gnostic Christians are, of course, equating that with the demiurge figure, the craftsman god, who they also in some cases associate with Satan. So this text has these sorts of, really interesting ideas in it that the Gnostics developed.
Speaking of the famous introduction to the Gospel of John, a beautiful, beautiful piece. That has been a source of debate for a long time, Some scholars have believed it was tacked on from another tradition, perhaps Philonic. What are your views on it?
I don't think it's tacked on from another tradition, and the reason I don't is that the themes that hymn have in it are picked up by the author of the Gospel of John throughout the text, and so it's woven in. The ideas are woven into the text itself, the main body of the gospel. But it's certainly a hymn. It was probably a hymn that the community was performing, perhaps in their baptismal ceremony or when they got together and partook of the Eucharist. But it certainly is some kind of a hymn. It is perhaps based on, and scholars have been very interested in following the traditions of Sophia in order to explain that hymn, that the logos there is some kind of Sophia figure who's come to earth. There is some difficulty with that in that Sophia isn't really ever God exactly, and she also doesn't ever really incarnate as a human being. She possesses human beings, so there's some trouble with that, and it's probably more likely that you've got again a blending of ideas that the Sophia traditions are behind that, but you also have behind that the traditions of God's name. His name was actually personified as a being. His name, the Yahweh name, was actually him. And they developed the tradition, of course, of the angel of the name, an angel who bears his name and who basically functions as God, as a manifestation of God, a kavod type figure. And this is, I think, can explain the notion that the Logos was God because he bore God's name. And Jesus actually in the Gospel of John talks about having God's name and possessing the name. So I think more work needs to be done in that area, but it certainly is a beautiful hymn that became very important to the Gnostics.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure they went gaga over the whole concept of the logos, as well as Alexandrian Jews, Stoics, and other pagans. They must have just loved the whole concept of the logos that wasn't found in Christianity. Now, another question, April. Who do you think the mysterious beloved disciple was? I know, loaded question.
That is really loaded. I actually think it's Lazarus. So there's my short answer.
That's what I've always thought too.
The text actually understands Lazarus as being the disciple whom Jesus loves and weeps for, and we only get to switch into this language of the disciple whom Jesus loved without a name after Lazarus has been introduced as the one that Jesus loves in the narrative, and after Jesus raises him from the dead, and he becomes basically a resurrected being walking on earth. And so that, and I think chapter 21 can only be explained as the death of Lazarus, the beloved disciple. In other words, the community was pretty darn sure that Lazarus had been raised from the dead and would not die. And when he died, it caused a crisis in the community. What is going on? Jesus raised him from the dead. He was never supposed to die. And so the need then to tack on chapter 21 in order to explain that Jesus really didn't say he wasn't going to die. So that's my longer explanation, but I think it's Lazarus according to the narrative of the text.
Well, have you heard of a theory saying, the scene with Jesus raising Lazarus and the two Mary mourning over the tomb is a reconstruction of Horus raising Osiris with Isis and Nefertiti, mourning over the tomb. Have you heard that theory?
No, but certainly, all of our texts are in some way knowledgeable about all of the mythology of the ancient world. And so whenever these texts are constructed, the story is going to be told with nuances, right, that are going to take up themes from the mythology that the audiences will be aware of.
Like you make the great example of how Jesus wasn't recognized, and the ancient motif back then would have been Homer. He wasn't recognized when he came home.
Right, with Odysseus, exactly.
So I'm sorry, yes, Odysseus. And moving on, could you also give us a brief reconstruction of what the Thomasite community might have looked like, as well as their theological goals?
Sure. The Thomasite community, I've worked on quite extensively, and I've come to understand these people as basically the early Christians in Syria. These people appear to have been the result of a mission from Jerusalem of an Aramaic form of Christianity very early that was extremely eschatological, and these people were millenarians. They were very sure that the end of the world was going to happen any time, which may in some ways be the oldest teaching of the early Christians we have in terms of Jesus and Jesus's own teaching. And over time within this community, as this end of the world didn't happen and became more and more delayed, they set about rewriting their traditions that had been brought to them from Jerusalem. And what they did is what I talk about is they shift their point of view from the end of the world and all the promises that God has promised for the end of the world to being present promises. So they begin thinking about Jesus' resurrection as something that already started the resurrection from the dead. So the end of the world is already in process. And so we can already begin living like angels. And to do that, we need to be giving up sexual practices and become celibates like angels, or at least like the good angels. We don't want to be like the bad angels and the fallen angels. Like the angels, we can have a spiritual body right now and be holy right now. And we can reap all the benefits of paradise while we're on earth. And so we can start having visions of God and living within his presence and living within paradise. And so this is the sort of shift that you see happening in the Syrian materials in the beginning of the 2nd century. So the late 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century. And what you have forming in Syria at this time is an extremely what we call encratic form of Christianity. That means Syncretism is a form of self-control where they need to get control of their passions, get control of things like eating, and so they fast, they don't drink alcohol, they don't eat meat, they don't have sex. They're basically trying to be angels living on earth. This form of Christianity appears to be what was going on in Syria at this time. All of the literature that's being produced by the Christians in Syria at this time is this sort of ancratic material and visionary, very much visionary directed. They're talking about ascending into heaven, seeing God, that this is something one needs to do before death in order to be saved. And it's not really until you get into the 4th century that you start seeing some of the fathers in the Syrian literature talking about allowing married Christians into the church. And so there seems to be something happening in the maybe the late 3rd and early 4th century in which you see this shift in opening up the Christian church in Syria to married couples rather than just singles. And they also at that time then take the singles, or what they're calling the virgins, and they elevate them to an elite status. And these people become what are known as the sons and daughters of the covenant. And so Syrian Christianity is very interesting, but I think a very different form of Christianity than most Westerners are familiar with.
And unlike the Johannite community you mentioned, they were a lot looser in allowing people to have their own mystic vision experiences, right?
Yeah, they're certainly encouraging visionary experience. But again, I think that they probably are trying to control that as well in terms of, probably through communal interpretation of the vision and that sort of thing. Now, think about this really. Think about these Thomasine folks. And again, you can call them Thomasine community, you can call them early Syrian Christians, that doesn't really matter. But these people in some way are a precursor to contemporary Orthodoxy, as in Byzantine traditions, where you have, the monks are very much, they're into actual practice of meditation in order to have a vision of the great Taboric light. And the tradition is about the laity becoming like very controlled in their life. They're married, yes, but they still have a very controlled life. They attempt to live what in the ancient world would be called a very righteous life, a life of piety, and so forth. So I think we've got in this early Syrian literature and then the Thomasine material some precursors of what is to come.
And of course the Syrian literature is just not the Gospel of Thomas. What else would be included, or would you have people read?
Sure. Well, another text, the Dialogue of the Savior, which is a text in Nag Hammadi. There's also a text in Nag Hammadi called Thomas the Contender, or Thomas the Athlete, the Acts of Thomas. In fact, most of the apocryphal Acts, not all of them, but most of those. The Odes are another one, the Odes of Solomon. Very, very beautiful hymns coming from the Syrian tradition. You have Tatian and the Diatessaron. It's a very good example there, where he takes the 4 Gospels plus his knowledge of kind of the way the saints' tradition of Jesus was in the ancient world, which the Thomasine materials seem to know as well. And he blends that all into one Gospel in which he takes and modifies it to this ancratic viewpoint.
This might be a little bit loaded question, but what are some of the theories on the connection and separation between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas? Obviously, the most famous one we have right now is Elaine Pagel's, even though it wasn't her idea. I think she took it from Riley, that the Gospel of John was written as a polemic against the Gospel of Thomas. Where do you stand on that one, April?
Yeah, I stand in the same place, and essentially the three of us were talking about this at the same time in terms of our writing as well as personally. And I think that's exactly right. The Gospel of John is connected in some way to the Thomasine traditions. It's aware, maybe not of the Gospel itself, but certainly of the traditions that the Gospel of Thomas is purporting. And I think it is certainly some sort of a polemic to try to either dissuade people from that viewpoint. Something like that is going on with this text. You have the Gospel of in the Gospel of John, you have the Thomas disciple really front and center in terms of being corrected by Jesus.
Yeah, you call him a false hero.
Yeah,
that's his role.
yeah, he becomes a false hero in this text, and he's corrected, and he doesn't know the way, Jesus says to him, He says, I don't know the way. Jesus says to him, better is it if you don't see, right, but believe. And so this all is very polemical, and it's directed against the traditions of Thomas, which in Syria are all about vision. And and Thomas there is a hero. He's not an anti-hero. He's a hero. There's even a text in the Acts of John in which John is the one who is afraid of having a vision rather than Thomas. So we've got some really interesting polemic there against the Gospel of John, kind of this back and forth. Who is the true disciple? Who's the one? John or Thomas?
And what are some of the other theories? I think you mentioned Stephen Davis, who believes that they actually came from the same fountainhead, right?
Right, and there's also some people who I think would argue that Thomas may be dependent on John rather than the other way around.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't see that, because I see the Gospel of Thomas is not a polemic. It's not in any way arguing against the Gospel of John. What it appears to be is knowledgeable of similar traditions, and then but the Gospel of John is the one that has the polemical language against the mysticism, at least the vision mysticism that we find being promoted in Syria. So anyway, that's why I would argue the other way on that.
And then you have another radical idea. You mentioned scholar Schenke, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, who believed the beloved disciple was actually Judas Thomas.
Right. And actually, I believe Charlesworth also thinks that this is the case. But again, I just don't believe this can be supported internally on the narrative of the Gospel of John. And I think that that's where we need to start with that question, if not end with that question, because the beloved disciple, it doesn't actually say beloved disciple in the text. It's the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that phrase is directly connected to Lazarus in the Gospel of John. And so I think that we need to credit that.
So would it be a mistake to say that the Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic gospel? Should we call it a Syrian gospel? Or perhaps, as some believe, it started some way and then slowly had Gnostic elements added to it throughout time?
Right. I mean, it's all a matter of definition and in one way one defines, not Gnostic. I would prefer to call the Gospel of Thomas a mystical gospel. I think it's promotes more mysticism. When I think of Gnostic and Gnosticism, there's really kind of two unique items that I key on, and that is that there's in the text or the tradition some kind of a pre-cosmic fall within the Godhead, something that happens within God that is going to bring about basically sin in the world. Whether it be the error of Sophia or the kind of evolution or devolution of Adamus or whatever that is, it's something that happens prior to creation. And then secondly, I have a creator God who is either ignorant or working in opposition to some sort of a supreme God that is beyond this cosmos. And so those are the elements that I look for, because those are, when you look at all the literature, lay it out all next to each other, those would be the kind of two unique strands of thought that you find within Gnostic materials. that differentiate it from other things like Hermeticism or Platonism or, in this case, mysticism. Now, Gnostics can be mystics. I mean, they can also be interested in having visions and like meeting God in the immediate, but all mystics aren't Gnostics. So I would prefer to call the Gospel of Thomas a mystical gospel that represents the sort of encratic Christianity that developed early on in Syria.
Lastly, April, you see, we joked about Irenaeus and, his shenanigans, but would you say that perhaps one of the reasons the Gospel of John was accepted was that it's a real gospel that puts the nail in the coffin in any doubt that Jesus is God?
Yeah, I mean, this is a theology that Irenaeus was trying to save. And so, that theology isn't quite as shall we say, blatant or visual in the synoptic narratives as it is in John. I mean, John, you have God walking around on earth. And it's clear from the very first verse that that's what's happening. And this was important to many early Christians in terms of their salvation, because as they would say, God became man, so man can become God. I mean, this is their famous lines, and Irenaeus is, right in there in that sort of ideology. So this gospel does that for him, and he is going to he's going to have it, and he makes an argument, and for some reason this argument made sense in the ancient world. I've got 4 winds and I have 4 corners of the world, so I need 4 gospels, and John is our 4th one. A much beloved gospel. It may have been that he was using it in his church as well. The texts that were being used across a large geographical area within liturgy were also ones that seemed to make the cut over and again. Something like the Gospel of Thomas, which seems to be pretty much Syrian text. I mean, that community really understood it and used it. There's also a real encratic community down in Alexandria, and so it makes its way down there, and that community also picks it up, but the Romans weren't all that interested in it. The Westerners, this was not their gospel.
But April, I think that's about all the time we have today.
All right.
I'd like to thank you very much for once again coming on Aeon Byte and giving us some of your wisdom.
Always happy to.
In my